It's Wednesday, June 13th, 2018. My name is John Hollar, and I'm here to take this oral history this morning.
I'm Regis McKenna. I've been in Silicon Valley over 50 years, and I'm here to be interviewed by John Hollar.
It's a pleasure to have you do this, Regis, and I should say for the record that our ultimate hope on this is that it's going to be a multi-part oral history, perhaps 7, 8 sessions, maybe more, depending on how it all plays out. And as you noted in your own introduction, you really are, I think it's fair to say, the dean of Silicon Valley in many ways, because you've seen so much and you've done so much and you've been so instrumental to so many top executives and organizations as a strategist and in other ways, and it's a chance really in this oral history to capture all of that background and knowledge and history and to get your insights. And our hope, as it is with every oral history, is that someday 25 or 30 or 50 years from now, a young historian or a group of historians will find all this to be very valuable as they put the total picture together. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
You're welcome.
Let's start with your childhood and your upbringing. You were born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Can you talk a bit about your mother, your father, your family, and your growing up there?
Yes, I was my parents were, Irish Catholic. Their parents on both sides came from Ireland, and they had large families, and but sort of lower middle class. They weren't, although my father's family was stonemasons, so they had plenty of employment. My mother's family was less well off, and my father, but dropped out of school at age of 14 or 15 to get a job, and finished his schooling going to night school. So he got his high school degree at I think it was Shenley High in Pittsburgh, and was working as a water boy on the digging ditches, and along with the getting water for the mules and those sorts of things. And he used to talk about it quite a bit. And he worked his way up to run one of their major divisions over 50 years. And that was sort of the model of work. It was you get a job at a sort of a public utility, you work your way up, and you achieve success. My father was a strict disciplinarian. My mother was much more of the comforter and the one we went to all the time for everything. She also dropped out of school when she was 13 because her mother was dying, and she took care of her mother, and then became sort of the household mother for the family. In fact, even her one brother used to send her Mother's Day cards all the time, even when they were older, because she took care of the house. So she worked. They both worked very, very hard in their life, and that was sort of the whole model of it: work hard, have faith, give to your community. My father was very active in community services of all kinds, and he was also quite, obstinate in his views and very determined in his views. He was a little man. He was about 5'6", but he was a fire plug, and so he was very tough, and would challenge. If anybody challenged him, he would take it on. He was a fighter all through his whole life, and so he had this. If he sees a wrong, he would go and try to correct it, no matter what it was. And I think it was something that sort of helped me through my life, because I think a lot of my brothers, and by the way, I had 6 brothers, so there were 7 boys in the family. So the characteristics and the personality traits of my parents worked well with 7 boys, taking care of them. So there was the sort of soft side and then the hard side, and they worked well together.
Where were you in the pecking order?
I was 6th. And there's, quite frankly, there's sort of pros and cons to that, but or maybe pluses and minuses. The plus is, and I always saw it as a plus, quite frankly, is that by the time you come around number 6, you're not paid attention to. So you're left on your own. And, I was out of the house as soon as I could walk, and exploring the neighborhood, exploring the area where we lived, and doing things that other kids didn't do, and getting into trouble, but by and large being able to sort of not have my parents always hovering over me as they did my younger brother, who was the last, and the older ones who were a little bit more special in that 4 of them went into religious life.
Did they become priests?
2 did, and 2 became brothers. But 2 of them then left. One brother, one priest left some years later. So that became sort of an Irish Catholic family. That becomes sort of your aura, and so your school, it's the family in the parish that has all the religious. They knew my family. The nuns never used to give me too much harsh treatment because they would always say, "We don't want to upset your poor mother," because with the problem she has now with 7 boys. So you're left alone a bit and left on your own. And to me, I love that whole aspect of having independence, and I pursued it. There was. We grew up in sort of a suburb of Pittsburgh. It was a relatively new development. The houses were older. We lived in a house that was built in the late 1800s, but it was a big stone home. But it was called Brookline. But on the outskirts of Brookline were all farms, and there were still woods. There were coal mines. There were the railroad tracks went out on the outskirts of it down the Ohio, and out the Monongahela toward down into Maryland and West Virginia. And so I could, as a kid, I explored all that. I would go out and just go on hikes and go into the coal mines and hike the railroad tracks and hop trains and do all that sort of thing by the time I was 10 years old.
How easy was that to do? I don't know. I mean, I did it. I didn't think about how easy or hard it was. You just sort of did it. And it certainly mustn't have been that difficult. But the farms were kind of interesting because we played ball where it was right next to a farm. So if you hit the ball, it went into a pasture where there were bulls and things like that. And so you didn't really, when you're a kid, I don't think you think about it in terms of sort of letting values on it. You just do it and enjoy it. And I had a wonderful childhood. I liked my childhood. With your mother and father not having had an opportunity to finish school, how did they feel about schooling for you and your brothers?
My parents believed in one thing, and that is behavior. If your deportment was good, you were fine. They never questioned your grades or anything like that. I mean, they weren't happy about them, but they never really punished you for not having good grades. My older brothers were really good at school. And so, it was sort of an expectation that you would be, particularly from the nuns. You're not like your brother, you'd hear once a day.
Is that what you heard?
Oh, lots of times, yeah.
How were you as a student?
I was not a good student. I enjoyed the classes that I liked doing, and I didn't enjoy the classes I didn't like doing. And I got through it. I enjoyed it. I know we had a town library, a Carnegie Library, which was all in these little towns, and I spent a lot of time there. And I don't think I really was looking at school books. I think I was looking at adventure books and other types of things, anything that I could find, and bringing those home. But my older brothers were really, because they had gone into the monastery life, were very academic. And so that influenced me a lot because when they would come home, they would talk about some of the things they were learning. My brother Tom was really excellent at French, and and literature and things of that nature. And so a lot of that did rub off, more so than, say, my parents influencing me. My brother Bob, who was second oldest, was an artist, and started doing art very, very early when he was in high school. And so he would take me to, aside from taking me to ball games. Oh, by the way, he played on the football team with Johnny Unitas in high school.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah. So this goes back quite a while.
Was that wasn't Latrobe, was it?
No, it was St. Vincent's or St. Justin's College in Pittsburgh. That's where Johnny Unitas started, and so we would go to the art museums. He would take me to the art museums. He would take me out to various we went to the symphony all the time, that sort of thing. So it was really sort of my older brothers that sort of influenced me a lot in academic and those sorts of pursuits and interests.
It seems like the way you describe it, they were the ones who were opening up the world to you. It was showing you there were places and ideas beyond the town where you were growing up.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was certainly the case. And as I said, these small towns and very strict sort of Irish Catholic families are very restricting in many ways. And everybody knows what you're doing. Everybody knows. Everybody, if you misbehave, the whole neighborhood will bring you back into line. Or people in the neighborhood. And with the church having that sort of overriding influence on you, they are sort of overseeing you all the time. So that sort of influence, I think, was something that I sort of always rebelled a bit against, and I just didn't care to be under those kinds of stares and guises.
And with your parents emphasizing deportment so much, how did they react to that?
The way you would expect. But I'll tell you, give an example. This is in school. The nuns certainly had paddles, wooden paddles, and you did get those. But I hid them. I used to take their paddles and hide them.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Did they know you were doing it?
No, they just disappeared, and they could never. There was a wood shop that they would go have another one made, but I'm sure I had 4 or 5 of them made for me to replace the ones that I either threw away, or I would put them outside on the windowsill in the schoolroom or places like that.
So would you describe yourself growing up? You've used words like independent and a bit of a rebel. Were you feeling restless? Were you feeling just independent and wanting to do your own thing? How would you describe your attitude?
I don't know that I don't know that I felt that way, but when it happened, I enjoyed it more. I was in high school. I was president of the Catholic Youth Organization in Pittsburgh, and I did a lot of civic stuff, and I got, again, largely as sort of the influence of my father and family, and I was the only, because our high school didn't have sports or didn't have football, and I was a football fan. I did help form on my own a Sandlot League, and we joined a league sponsored by Hannes Wagner Sports Shop in Pittsburgh, and we played throughout the city. And I played football from the time I was, a freshman in high school. I played from 6th grade on, but from high school I played, and then I went to college. And that got me into college, actually. It's the reason I went to St. Vincent's.
Did you get a football scholarship?
What happened was they asked me, I was a walk-on, and they said if you make the team, they'll give you financial aid. So I actually wanted to pay my own way, simply because getting money out of my father wasn't easy. And so I worked during the summers. And I worked from the time I was 16 till now.
I want to back up for just a minute on that point. It wasn't necessarily a natural thing for you to want to go to college, was it? And what spurred you on to work beyond, not to go to work right out of high school, and to go ahead and want to go to a university?
I think that as I went on in high school, my older brother Joe, who's the next oldest from me, 2 years older than me, he diverted and didn't go to the other high schools. You could pick your high school. He went to a school a little bit further out of town, or in town, that was run by German nuns, and it was a kind of a German parish. So it was a very strict, better academic school. And so the demands at that school were higher, and that I think had a lot of influence on me, particularly in the areas of things like reading literature and writing and things of that nature. They were much better in that whole area. I was never very good at math, but I think that's because they told me I wasn't. If you remember, you were tested for things and told you're good at something and you're not good at other things. And so what they tell you is that because when I did take things like chemistry or in college I took physics, I loved it. And so I think you're sort of culturally moved into this sort of area where the best thing for you to do is go out and get a job.
Well, in fact, you told me a very poignant story about an 8th grade teacher who was assigning roles to people and maybe predicting what they would go on to do, and she designated you as the barber.
The town barber, yeah. I mean, these are the kind of aspirations, but again, that's more indicative of particularly the nuns who were very young, who were coming out of, again, sort of middle class or lower middle class families. Most of them were just a year or two out of college, if that, or still, many of them were still going to college and then teaching because they were having a shortage. So their aspirations were to become a nun, and that was sort of, their family's wishes too. And so those things, they recapitulate themselves to where there isn't a lot of, emotional support or guidance or direction that comes up. I mean, I helped my granddaughters, go around to different colleges, and I would tell them, no one did this to me. I picked my own college, and I went there, and the way I could get in was by doing a walk-on football. I did go try it. I was accepted at several other colleges, but the criteria was it had to be Catholic. So my parents had a veto, but not where.
So now you're in college. Let's talk a little bit about, let me back up before we go to college. You've talked about a couple of things that I think are really interesting. One was organizing your own sandlot football league, and another was running for the presidency of the Catholic Youth Organization. Was that always just part of you, this organizing, this building coalitions of people and sort of getting people together? And was that, did you just find that a natural part of who you were?
Yeah, and again, I can only say that I think that comes from my father. My oldest brother, he's a priest. He's in a parish in Atlanta. If he weren't a priest, he'd be a politician. He's a great organizer, social organizer, and he has spent his life doing social organizations and helping people. And so I think those sorts of influences are around you. I don't think you consciously think about it. It just happens. And when you're aware that there are such organizations, you step up and take advantage of them. The one in high school was kind of interesting, and one of the reasons I got involved in it is that one of the things we did is we used to hold a lot of dances. And the nuns controlled the purse for when you did that and what money was taken in and all that sort of thing. And so I decided that I didn't want them to have the money. And so I went and convinced the principal that what they ought to do is let us do this independently. And for some reason or other, she let me do it. And so I started organizing the dances and the groups and raising money. And then I would go out and get donations of pop and soda and whatever from various people that I knew in the neighborhoods. And we made a lot of money. We bought our own turntable. We were able to hire some disc jockeys and do that sort of thing. And so I had my own bank account, or we had our own bank account. And so it was sort of we want to control what we're doing rather than have the nuns overseeing you all the time. And it's just a rebellious kind of thing, but that led to the sort of the social organization.
Let's talk now about going to college. Your decision to go. You've talked about you had to be a walk-on football player and wanted to be in order to get into college. What was that like for you?
Most of my friends were going to the local college, Duquesne University, or the University of Pittsburgh, I really, again, the attraction to St. Vincent's was that it was not in Pittsburgh. It was out of town. It was in the country. It was actually a farm. And it was an all-men's college, Benedictine college, about 50, 60 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. And
St. Vincent College.
Yeah, in Latrobe, where Arnold Palmer is, famous. And also Herb Boyer, who was one of the founders of Genentech, went to St. Vincent's. He was there at the same time I was, though we didn't know it until years later.
Know each other?
We didn't know it till years later. It was, it again was this sort of you're on your own independence. I rarely went home. I stayed there on weekends. I stayed there even on holidays and so forth. I was able to, it was out in the country. You could go hiking in the woods. You could explore. You could do whatever you wanted to do. I really enjoyed my first 2 years there. First semester I was not great academically. I was actually on probation, academic probation, and I got some religion and came back and did well the second year, or the second semester. And then I decided that I didn't want to play football. I had worked that summer, so I had made a fair amount of money. I was actually went to work for my father's company, digging ditches and cutting right away, and so that was a really well-paying job, quite frankly.
That was a utility company.
It was a utility company, but it was again out in the country, working, and I was able. I put everything away, and so I was able to. And by the way, education, and then a college credit was something like $25 or something like that. It was not at all comparable to what it is today, and so by this sophomore year, I decided I was going to get serious and did, and got to be friendly with some of the priests there, and I wanted to. I had gone to St. Vincent's and I was in pre-law. They called it pre-law, and it was really economics and political science and things of that nature. And I still wanted to pursue that, but one of the things I sort of got into was the whole idea of philosophy, and I got that from a particular priest at St. Vincent's, we used to sit in his room at night, and quite frankly, he would have, would drink beer and talk with the students and so forth. And he was a real inspiration. He was a.
What was his name?
You're going to ask me that.
It's all right.
Okay.
We can figure it out.
I know it, and he passed away just about 2 years ago. But he was a tail gunner on a B-29 over Germany. And so he would tell these stories about being in a tail gunner and not
Those
being,
guys had a very high mortality
yeah,
rate.
and not being able to wear a parachute because the turret wouldn't move and so forth. And so him and some of the others they were more, you were in a men's college, and it was they were men, and so they didn't mind going to the bars with you and so forth. So it was a great environment for me anyway. But he told me that if I wanted to pursue both, if I wanted to pursue law, but if I wanted to pursue, say, philosophy, that Duquesne University had one of the preeminent philosophy departments in the world at that time. And it was in existential philosophy. And they had brought in all these Fulbrights and all these people from Holland and from Europe who were leading edge philosophers and psychologists. And they published a lot of original books. A lot of the textbooks were written by the people that you may have, Rollo May. I had courses from Rollo May, people like that. They were really, and so now when you went there, you sort of fell into taking these courses of interesting people rather than pursuing any particular academic. And so I started piling up credits, but not toward graduation. And I took a fair amount of undergraduate or graduate courses as well.
This was at Duquesne.
Yeah.
While you were still enrolled at St. Vincent.
Yeah, so I transferred to Duquesne in mid-semester. Yeah, I should back up. I transferred to Duquesne, and then, from then on, I was, I was on the dean's list every semester from then on.
Let's go back to your relationship to the philosopher for a moment. What was it about philosophy and the way you found his approach to philosophy to be so compelling to you, who only a year earlier had been on academic probation?
Well, I think it was just the person himself. His name was Father Paul, and it was really just he and his personality and his ability to relate to you, and to be interested in you and your pursuit, regardless of the fact that I was going to that school. He was telling me there's a better school for you, and not to get rid of me, because I was also kind of a pain there.
But to promote you, to support you.
Yeah, but to support you. And but then when I went to Duquesne, there was a professor. His name was Bernard Bolin, Boelan, and Dr. Bolin was, he had a doctorate in physics, philosophy, psychology. He was Dutch. He escaped Holland from the Nazis, him and his family. He had such a broad range of knowledge and interest in so many different things. And felt that it was that holistic knowledge that really you gained a lot in life from and could use in any area. So if you went into law, it would teach you how to think differently, but think more from a holistic viewpoint than simply a rubric standpoint. And he was so popular as a professor that they had to allocate seats to departments for him. Well, he happened to be a neighbor of mine. He had moved into our neighborhood.
Literally.
Literally. And so I got to know him really, really well. And in fact, even after Diane and I got married while in school, we lived right near him. And I used to go home on the bus, and we'd stop at the bar, and he would test me at the bar, because he did all oral tests on each student.
All oral tests?
All oral. Yeah, no written tests, he would oral, so he could question you. And so he became a really, really advisor, friend, teacher, guide, probably the most influential person in my life, and in which I think his ideas I used throughout my career here, which was to look at things from a holistic viewpoint and not simply the point that's in front of you.
Do you remember how he communicated that, or what it was about his way of thinking about things that was so powerfully influential to you?
the question you asked was, in what particular way did Bolin, impress you, or what was his sort of pedagogical way of reaching knowledge,
Yes.
and getting it infused into students? And it was this ability to bring all different kinds of aspects together. He wrote a book on maturity, and so it was a philosophy book, but it was psychology. It was about the different stages of life and what sort of discoveries you make in those ages, and
Natural ages, meaning the age of, or the era that you're passing through as a person. Is that what you mean?
Well, and also physical age, your physical age, because he felt that you really only become mature after 60, and that's whenever we tend to retire people, he said, and then in fact that's when wisdom starts to blossom, and you can start reflecting and using history as a guidepost and things of that nature. And so he would, in that course, he would bring almost all of his academic interests together. Or if he were he taught a course on phenomenology, and that was different. He taught a course on Heidegger and Being in Time, which you probably know is one of the most complex books in the world, but he made it quite simple. And it was really about this sort of external world that we live in and how it speaks to us. And when you think about that, I mean, this is research. This is taking in data that is not necessarily what's in front of you, but what's all around you. And I think that's what a good strategist does. They take in every aspect they can, they sift it, and I mean, just to jump ahead, what I often did with clients was stand on the board and we'd start talking about problems, and I would just start sort of building diagrams across the whiteboard and putting up different things, and then start piecing them together over an hour or 2 or 3 hours. And that really came out of that sort of thinking.
It seems that Bolin and his approach fit your brain, if you will. It fit the way that you thought, or he sparked something that in you said, yeah, that's the way I think about the world, or now I understand that's the way I think about the world.
Yeah, and he was he was just a sort of regular person. I mean, I say that, but he was very unusual in all the degrees he had. He could write Latin and Greek on either hand on the board at the same time. I mean, he was a brilliant man, and so, but he opened up a broader world of vision, I think, and aspiration for students that, and as I said, because a lot of teachers took his courses just to be exposed to his broad thinking. He taught courses on history, and later on in his life, by the way, he was hired by technical companies to help them think through issues and problems of the companies. Even while he was a professor at DePaul University.
Do you think he saw that in you too?
Well, I don't know. I know that we had many long conversations together on the bus and at the bar, and about life and all sorts of things. But that's the kind of person that you could do that with, and it was a rare experience, I think. And Diane took some courses from him too. I mean, and we both knew him and his family and his wife very well.
When did you meet Diane?
I met Diane when I went to Duquesne, and that's also another interesting story. My brother Joe had a good friend named Art Kelly, and Art Kelly had a part-time job to earn his way through college. And when he was graduating, he passed that job on as someone had passed it on to him, and he passed it on to me. That job was being janitor of an all-girls high school. So I accepted. It was actually a great job. It doesn't sound as wonderful as you think. I mean,
Not a bad job for a young man, though.
not a bad job for a young man. And largely it was right on the line of what we called the bus line, where the bus drove by it, that school, to go to Duquesne. So it was within 5 miles of Duquesne in downtown Pittsburgh. And so you could, after school, I could take classes there at night or during the day, and then go and work and do things, and then go back to school. And the cafeteria was always open. So, and it paid a nice wage, actually. It was actually assistant janitor. It wasn't the janitor. It was an elderly man who was janitor, Mr. O'Toole. But that summer, you would work the full summer, painting floors, painting the buildings, doing all sorts of things that couldn't be done during the school year. And Diane was also working during the summer there. She was a student and was working to help pay her and her sister's tuitions. And so we met during our summer work there, and started going swimming together. And the rest is history.
And that's how it happened.
Well, we were kindred spirits. Her, not necessarily, but her mother's idea was, you get out of school, you get a job, and you go to work and help support the family. And Diane, all her teachers were telling her at her all-girls high school, she was good in math, she was good in literature, she was good in a lot of things, and they wanted her to go to college, and her parents couldn't afford it, so we commiserated over that. And eventually I sort of said, I'll put you through college.
That's fantastic. Did you work every year, summers and during school?
I worked from the time I went to work in high school and worked after school, yeah.
And did you mentioned that you decided you didn't want to play football. Did you lose your scholarship and then have to pay your own way?
Well, that was half a semester, basically. By the time I decided not to do that, there just wasn't. First of all, college football wasn't at all to me like Sandlot football, which was free and fun and people that you knew, and there was a lot more team cohesion. When you go to these colleges, everybody's a prima donna. If one person, there was a fellow that got hurt, and he was afraid that everybody else, including me, would take his position. So they constantly. So there's this sort of competitiveness among players rather than against another team. That's what I found it. So I didn't really enjoy it. In fact, even when I did that, I used to go home and play on the Sandlot team on weekends, and that was much more of a team spirit, and we won the city championship in when was it 1958 or something like that, and so but we played some junior colleges. It was a unlimited weight, and it was so it was a pretty serious team.
And you were playing against guys much bigger than you too. It
Oh,
seems like.
yeah.
They grow them big in Western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, a lot of these guys, our linemen averaged about 250.
Wow, even then.
And I kept them in front of me. But I was fast.
You were fast. And
I was fast.
A little feisty, no doubt.
Yeah.
So you're finishing up at Duquesne, and this is the late 50s. What was Pittsburgh or that area of Western Pennsylvania like at that time?
Well, my sort of vision opened up as I started leaving school and looking for something, serious to do. And it was either go on and get your education, which, quite frankly, I couldn't afford, and my parents couldn't have afforded, and or get a job. And I think if I were to pursue, let's say, philosophy, I would have had to got a PhD. That would have taken some time and money and so forth. And Diane and I had gotten married, and I just started, beating the bushes for work, and spent a lot of time walking around. I mean, I used to have to hitchhike into the city of Pittsburgh because I didn't have cash to pay the car fare.
Was this 1960?
This was in 1960, yeah. And the mills were really seriously shutting down. Pittsburgh had gone through a renaissance in the late 50s. Mayor David Lawrence, who eventually became the governor of Pennsylvania, set about a renewal plan, which was to bring clean industry in, clean up the rivers, and so there were very heavy restrictions placed on the heavy industry productions and so forth. As a kid, I remember going into the city of Pittsburgh with my father and asking him, why is it night and day? Because the city was just so overcast with the smog and soot from the mills. If you drove out along the river, it looked like you were driving into hell, literally. The open hearth furnaces, it was these red and yellow and blasts. I mean, something you wouldn't forget even as a small child. You'd remember them. And of course we could see those glows on the sky from where we lived at night when they would take the slag out of the open hearth furnaces and dump it out along the railroad tracks, and so it was like fireworks every night. And of course it just you had to. Spring cleaning really did have to be done. You had to clean the house from top to bottom, all walls and everything. It was, it was quite a task to stay, clean in that environment, your house or anything, or your car, and so the mills were vanishing. Another person who went through that was Bill Campbell, who was from Homestead, and unemployment at some areas there were 40-50%. And you might say, well, those are in the mills, and yes, they were, but the mills supported an infrastructure of all kinds of service industries, and those service industries were dying as well. And so there really wasn't much left in Pittsburgh. A lot of the storefronts were boarded up, and that happened for years and years later too. I mean, when we go back, so I sort of beat the streets, looking in the paper and doing things. And the particular job I got was from a firm that you signed up with, and if they found you a job, you had to pay your first 3 months' salary over some period of time to them.
All 3 months?
Yeah. But it was in increments. Okay?
Sure.
They did, but it was 3 months, and then they would put it over, I think, a year.
That's quite a fee.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, they were in charge. So they introduced me to this company. It was Rimback Publishing Company. It was a family-owned company. It was in the Oliver Mansion, who was one of the original iron and steel kings of the Iron Age, or of the Industrial Age, and it was one of these huge wooden structures on the north side of Pittsburgh that had, I don't know, 6 floors or something, and it was a mansion, and the publishing company was all entire in there, and they were publishing books and magazines. And the magazines were instruments and control systems, medical electronic news, military systems design, and I don't remember the others.
Very technical.
Very technical, and they had a technical writing staff. And I went in, and Richard Rimback, who was the founder, who was really quite an accomplished individual in his own right. He had started a magazine called Automation. He had helped form the Instrument Society of America. He had helped form the American Chemical Society. He was again, one of these multi-talented technical people. He was a very hard person. He looked like Teddy Roosevelt, and he acted like Teddy Roosevelt. And so his daughter was doing the recruiting, and so she brought me in and sat me down in front of him. And he sat there. He had his pince-nez glasses on, and he looked like he had the mustache, and he just looked, and he kind of said, "I don't know what in the F to ask you." He had a mouth like a truck driver, and he said, "What did you major in?" Well, I wasn't about to say philosophy, and so I said liberal arts, and so he slammed his hand down. He says, "Good." He said, "These goddamn journalism majors come in here and try to tell me how to run my business." And he said, "How much does he want? Hire him." And that was it.
And that was it.
That was it.
That was the whole interview.
That was the whole interview. So, but the whole idea was for me to learn the business. And
were you relieved? Was that it was not an easy job search, and suddenly you were.
Oh no, I was 6 months of beating this, walking the streets and hitchhiking here and there and so forth, and getting some real rejections and there's a lot of things that may have gone on, and this I'm not 100% sure of, but somebody told me later that I was a diabetic. I became a diabetic when I was 19, type 1, and that also was a reason for people turning me down. I got turned down for jobs that were ridiculous. I mean, they just, once they see you're diabetic, they just automatically say no. And I got turned down for being a typewriter salesman. They said they didn't think I could lift the typewriters, that sort of thing. And so that was a stigma that a lot of people held against you. I was told later on that he was a diabetic, or his mother, one of the two. And his mother lived on the top floor, and he would go up every day and have lunch with her. But it was a marvelous family environment in which you knew everybody in the company. Every lunch break was in the lunchroom with about somewhere like 6 or maybe 8 engineers who were writers. We had long discussions. They would talk about what they were writing on, what was interesting, what was new. Political discussions. You had all sorts of discussions that they were involved in, but it was again a real education for me, and they covered new products in the field of technology at the time. But Hewlett-Packard was an instrumentation company. Varian was an instrumentation company. Sistren Donner, which was on the East Bay, was. So there was a fair number of companies out here that were sending in material for publication. And I became, I was copy editor. I helped make up the magazine and do all those sorts of things and rewrite new press releases and that sort of thing. And so, it just oriented me in the language of the technology of the day.
How did you find that, just personally? How did you respond to that? Was that good?
Oh, I loved it.
Good?
For me, it was a combination of I fooled around with art. I used to earn a little bit of money through college drawing portraits, and so so doing the artistic part plus my brother and all those sorts of things I liked. Plus getting involved in. I liked learning. I liked what I think I did from the St. Vincent and on in Duquesne was I learned to learn, and then it didn't matter what it was. Anything that was of interest, and my family can tell you that I am probably the most eclectic collector of interesting things in the world. Whatever the subject is, I have a book or something on it. And so I think that was one of these things that you could learn a great deal about. I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 years there, and then
It occurs to me, let me,
Go ahead.
just at this moment, you're in 1960, 61, and a couple of things occurred to me. Sputnik launches in 1957, and the whole country now becomes very aware of the implications of that. And you're also graduating from college, and your career is right at that pivot point of the pivot of the whole national economy. We're moving from, your story about what's happening in Pittsburgh is a national transitional story, isn't it? It's heavy industry is going away, a new kind of economy
Right.
has to grow up. There's an imperative represented by Sputnik and the rise of the Russian threat, if you will, and here you are, kind of at this moment in time. That seems really amazing.
Yeah,
to me.
it all came about if I recall, was in my going in my second year at St. Vincent. I think when Sputnik went up, and then there was all this discussion about new academic requirements, and that then transitioned when I went to Duquesne.
And it happened just that quickly.
And everybody was talking about it, and so there was this focus on, we got to step up everybody's criteria for getting through these courses. We've got to improve everybody's knowledge in some way, and so everything became much more intense, and you were aware of it. You were very aware of it. I could, if you want to digress just for a second.
Let's
and
do.
Go back. And I think it's part of maybe today's message, but I remember the end of World War II, and I may say, well, I was 5 years old, but I remember I was standing in the living room with my mother, and she was vacuuming the floor, and she stopped and she started crying. And when a child, that's impactful.
Yeah.
Why is your mother crying?
Yes.
And she said, the war's over. But I also remember the blackouts, and because my younger brother, who was a baby, needed certain things, and they had to change him or give him fed or whatever, even though the blackouts were there. And so, and then up through the Cold War, my father, who had reached a fairly high level or senior management level in this public utility, once brought home concentric maps of Pittsburgh. The center was red, then less orange, and then all the way out. And that was where, if the bomb hit there, this is where how many people would be killed. And he put that on the dining room table. And I was, 10 years old.
Yeah.
And these things, all of a sudden, the Sputnik, the other,
The Cold War,
there were
the nuclear
there
threat.
were meetings at your house. There were what do they call them? Civil service of whatever they call them.
Yeah.
We used to have these little gatherings at our house and houses in the neighborhood where they would come in and tell you how to protect yourself. At school, there were two things. One was getting under your desk, and the other one was going under the church. And I wrote 2 long poems about them, in fact, later on.
About those days?
Yeah, about wouldn't it be strange that, a million years from now finding me like a fossil in sandstone buried under my desk, because the supposedly that was to protect you from the bomb. Well, of course it was ridiculous, but under the church was different. The church was much thicker walls and floor, and it was very scary down there, and so you had to. That's where you hid.
And you practiced drills
And
going
you
down into
practiced
that
those
scary
constantly.
space.
Yes. And so you grew up in this sort of much more of the Cold War. At the beginning of the end of the other war, in the beginning of the Cold War, my brother Joe, who was in the service, was on part of those transports taking stuff into Berlin, and was actually held behind lines for a while on one of the convoys. And so, I mean, it becomes a very real thing to you as a kid. And I don't think that today there's sort of an appreciation for what this country has come through in the last 50, 60 years to achieve where we are today, and to watch it sort of vanish. So when that whole academic interest came, people took it seriously, and I think even the fact that I said I'm going to get serious, was I'm not going to get a job anywhere unless I do get serious.
Yes, yes. Well, and yours was the generation that went to college, didn't it? I mean, the post-war GI Bill generation that got university educations and did so much of this work.
Yeah, that's true.
The transitioning.
That's true, yeah.
I want to go back just for a minute, Regis, to Rimback and the engineers that you were meeting, and your immersion into all of this. Were you asked by Rimback at that point, or did you volunteer to really get heavily involved in the more technical publications, the things that eventually led you to come to California? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, when you work in a small company, a startup, which this couldn't have been more than 20 or 25 people in this company. I mean, there were certainly printers and so forth beyond that they did to farm all that out. But by and large, the core group there was maybe 15, 20 key people. And when those are the people that you sat with at lunch. Those were the people that you asked questions of. And those were the people that would be talking about a particular, maybe the fellow that was the editor of Military Systems Design would say, I got this article on such and such a thing, and we're trying to decide whether or not this article fits in this context or whatever. That opens up something for you to ask some questions. And so it's your Q&A, it's your master's degree in terms of finding out what's going on. In the meantime, I was saying, well, how do you get a magazine ready for publication? What do you do? And that's all done by hand, And so I went through and literally, laid out magazines and measured the type and fit it into various spaces and photographs and so forth. And you actually lay out the magazines, and so you go through that process. But in the meantime, you may have to edit a press release down because it has to fit. So you go to an engineer and you'll say, help me with this, and writer. And so it's all part of the learning process. And it's wonderful in those small business environments to learn.
How did they take to you as the new liberally educated kid on the block?
Oh, they loved it. I mean, we got along really, really well. I never had any problems there at all.
Did you find you liked working with technically minded people like they were?
Oh yes, because in fact, you always felt as though you were learning something. It wasn't the small talk was always serious talk. It was about politics, or it was about something going on in the city, but it was never trivial.
What was it that after you'd worked for them for a couple of years that caused you to come to California?
Well, one day, Rimback, the publisher, called me into his office and he said, you're never going to make any money inside here in editorial as a writer, he said, or those sorts of things. And he said, you can only make money in sales because you can get commissions and all that sort of thing. And so he said, so how would you like to try sales? And I said, I never thought about it. Yeah, I'll try it. And so they actually gave an examination to the people that they were trying for a new sales position out here in California. And they asked, his daughter asked me to take the test, which I did. And I guess somehow I came out, better than the other salesmen that they had, and so he sent me to Philadelphia for a few months for training under another sales guy, which I did. And it was nice because my younger brother was working there in Philadelphia. And so we moved there for a short while and got to spend more time with him. And then one Sunday afternoon, and I didn't know anything about California at that time, I got a call from again, Rimback, and he said, we'd like you to move to California. And I kind of, wow. I mean, I somehow, as a kid growing up and seeing California in the movies, to me always was a neat thing. I would never have said no to that. Plus the fact that I didn't mind being on my own or being more independent. So Diane, we were in a little room about as big as this, and I covered up the phone and I said, how would you like to move to California? And she said, how long do I have to make up my mind? And I said, 2 minutes. And she said, why not? And so I said, okay. And, the next week I flew to Pittsburgh and then on to California.
That's great.
So it was a 2-minute decision. And if it weren't for Diane, and it was the fact that I think both of us had always liked the idea of being more independent and forging our own way. And I don't mean that just in a sort of an economic way or a business way, but forging our own way culturally, spiritually, in other ways in which you form your own opinions. And Diane was always sort of a rebel too in school. She was not quite as overt as I was about it, but she was able to challenge people in thought and things of that nature. And so, we really were very much in sync along that line. We were married 58 years, so it's worked.
That being in sync counts for a lot.
Yeah.
Was this 1963 when you moved out?
When we left, yeah.
Yeah,
Moved here in 63.
You mentioned earlier that because of the nature of the coverage of the magazines, you were aware of instrumentation companies like Hewlett-Packard and varying companies that were based on the West Coast. When you came out here, what did you have to do in order to make this thing work from a business standpoint?
Well, again, I'd followed around a salesman in Philadelphia, so I knew at least some of the ideas. But my natural inclination was to go in and not just simply try to sell somebody something. What I would tend to do is to lay out sort of a pattern of the companies I wanted to go see and try to get an appointment there. And I would go in and ask for all their literature. And then I would say thank you, and I would go away. And then I started subscribing to all the other technical magazines. And so I could look at their literature, try to figure out what it was, and look at the magazines and try to make some sense of it all. I used to lay it all out on the floor and piece it together. So when I went in, I could at least ask some intelligent questions. And that was sort of my modus operandi. And so I didn't go in and say, hey, I'm the new guy on the block, buy an ad. I would go in and try to ask more about them and what they're doing and what their goals and objectives and those kinds of things were. And these were not big companies. The VPs of marketing were, 10 feet from the door. They were, they were relatively still small companies, but there was quite a few of them. They were mostly, Aerojet General was up in Sacramento. Sister and Donner was up in the East Bay, way up in the East Bay. They made, most of these made military type of stuff, and even Fairchild's big business was military. I also had the Oregon and Seattle territories, and Oregon was Tektronix, which was oscilloscopes. And so, and then up in Seattle, there was a lot of medical instrumentation around the university up there. And so I was able, and of course I drove to all these places. I mean, I drove from here, I don't know, 2 or 3 times a year. I would drive up there and drive back, and you get to simply know a lot of people that way, and then you ask a lot of questions, and then you try to devise some way in which they should buy ads. Rimback was very partial to small companies and small advertisers. He didn't try to sell big budgets to people. These small companies, and as I told you, I was doing some notes, and I don't know that I can remember all the names of the companies, but there were a lot of small companies along Industrial Way in Redwood City, along in San Mateo, along the Bayshore there, and in Palo Alto, along the shorefront there. There were these small little office spaces, and there were little companies doing instrumentation, doing various types of components of some sort or other, or some kind of specialized device, communication devices, and so forth. In fact, it was there that I remember years and years ago, and when I first was there, that I met Tom Perkins before he even went to Hewlett-Packard. And I remembered him well, and we used to have conversations.
Was this when he was doing his laser
Yeah.
company? Yeah.
Yeah, but that was in a little, almost like a storefront thing. And so,
Did you sell him an ad?
I don't know, but I remember having a lot of conversations with him, and I remember, he had, he was that tall. He was a tall, sort of handsome-looking guy, and I just remembered him very well, though. And by the way, when he first opened up on Sand Hill Road, we had lunch almost soon after he went into his offices up there and became friends. So I knew him way back. Yeah. But in any event, you could sell them these little quarter-page ads. And they weren't that expensive, and it would help them get their word out. And then I would help them. The thing was that when they talked about, there really wasn't PR. There wasn't calling up the magazines and saying, hey, run an article or this sort of thing. Engineers would submit articles from time to time, but the articles were mainly written by the magazines, interviewing other people. And what they would do is they would send in the spec sheet, the technical spec sheet, with a photograph stapled to the top of it, and then the magazine would edit out the key specs and list the photograph. So you could collect those and send those into your magazine, for them as a little favor, and I did. I know I did really, really well in selling.
And you mentioned at that time too that the sales process was really based on engineers reading about all of these products and the specs and making buying
I think this
decisions.
is also a thing that is hard to sort of imagine right now, because we have the internet and we have all these efficient ways. There was no internet. There was no efficient way to reach thousands of engineers in the bowels of big companies. The way the engineers read. They literally read articles, long articles. They read competitive articles. They read benchmarks about this product versus this product. So you would have when you went into those companies, into GME and National, and we'd have our products benchmarked by an independent lab and then publish an article around that, because that's how engineers would measure your product against someone else's. So there was, and the journalist, if they favored, if they believed what your product was going to be better, and they could never really tell because everybody was pitching them, then in effect they would give you an article space, or maybe even a cover on your new product, that sort of thing, which is later what I would do, and I took advantage of that later on, because later on what I started doing was essentially sponsoring, or rather getting engineers, like when I went to National and GME and even Intel, is to give economic incentives for people to write articles. And then I hired engineers who were writers to work with them on writing the articles, so they didn't have to spend their life doing that.
So these journals and these trade publications, these newsletters, these were really important ways of getting to market.
It was the only way. It was the only way. And if the more attention that got in terms of a new product or special feature or comparative or whatever, the benchmarks were key. And the other thing I would do is I would take, and I'm moving a little further ahead, but I jumped since we're in the subject, I would take engineers or I would take management and put them on a plane and go to New York and sit down with the journalists and talk across a table with them. TI didn't do that. Motorola didn't do that. IBM didn't do that. None of those companies did that. They sent them stuff, or you went to see them. I mean, as the editor of Electronics magazine once told me, you know, we are summoned to their office. Nobody comes to visit us. And so, but we went back and sat down with them, and that sort of overcame this obstacle of these small West Coast companies who they did not believe would mount to anything. And I'll show you later, we'll talk later about how that came about.
So your experience at that, and on that side of the table, if you will, really informed your strategy for how to get to these important publications later on.
Right.
When you went
Right.
over.
And so I knew the editorial because I was at Rimback when the journalists were reviewing articles for publication.
Did you, I have here as one of my questions based on our earlier conversation, did you spot a gap in the marketing and communications strategies of these companies or areas that the publications themselves were missing that you felt like you could fill when you went into, say, GME, General Microelectronics, later on?
Yeah, I think it was this idea of working directly with the journalists.
Yeah.
And not through intermediaries, and going and sitting down and talking with them about them. GME was of course the first company that I was able to go, semiconductor company that I joined.
And what were they doing at the time?
Well, let's back up to GME. I went to work out of selling space. I didn't like that mainly because what I found was that it didn't solve people's problems. People would start wanting to run ads, and I'm talking them out of it, say it isn't going to help you, and I even did some research. Like Sister and Donner up in, they were selling accelerometers, and they said, well, there's only one customer for that, and I said, well, maybe there's more, and they would say no, and so I called just cold called down to White Plains testing facilities down in New Mexico, and started asking around for the scientists and engineers. And I got talking to several of them, and I asked them, what else could these accelerometers be used for? And so I wrote up a little report and gave it to them. And there was some new applications that they said they could be used for. So I gave that to Sister and Daughter, and that got me some advertising.
Yeah.
So
you were actually helping to open up markets for
well,
these.
it was this sort of thing of not just trying to, maybe it was my Irish Catholic background and feeling guilty about taking money from people when you know it isn't going to do them any good. And so I went to work for a small ad agency in Redwood City, and on the deal that instead of charging commission, this was the idea that I gave them was don't charge a commission for ads, because then you have to sell them ads to make money. Do a fee, do an annual fee per client, and on the fee you can help them with everything, what they need. So you do what they need, not what you have to sell. And so
that was a totally new concept to that agency.
Yeah. There was nobody was working on the fee system.
Yeah.
And we had he had a couple important clients. He had was one which was it was, above all things, was Open Heart. It was what were they known? Bartlett's Snow Pacific, I think it was. It was a big giant equipment company. And so that worked. I mean, they loved that because we could go in and sit and meet with them, and the clock was on us, not on them, and solve all kinds of problems and not have to come up with an ad. And one of the clients that at the time I was driving down in Santa Clara, and I was driving up and down, these new tilt-ups were going up. Tilt-ups where they pour the walls on the ground and then lift them up and you got a building. They went up overnight. And I was watching that happen, and one day I saw this tilt-up go up and people were moving in. And so I got out and I went in and asked for the marketing director. And it was a fellow by the name of Earl Gregory, and he said, we're just starting our company. It's called General Microelectronics, and we're a spin out of Fairchild. And I told him that, what I did, and he said, oh, you're hired. And so I went to work for him, not directly, but as their agency. And then after 6 months, he said, why don't you come to work for us? And so they had to build a technical writing group for proposals on the products that they were making. They needed literature. They needed, again, it was a small company, so you kind of did whatever was needed.
You were a one-stop shop.
Yeah, whatever you needed.
Within the company.
Yeah. And did a lot of demos, a lot of particularly because what GME eventually got into was MOS technology, and MOS was a different breed of animal. It wasn't germanium transistors, which was a version of transistors, or it wasn't a silicon transistor. It was making a substrate, silicon substrate, and then putting transistors down, these MOS transistors, that did not need the isolation because of the way they were constructed, so you could put more of them on a chip. And they didn't get, they didn't heat up as fast. And when you put them closer together, they're faster. So you could put more devices on a chip and do it faster. And a lot of companies were working on that at the time. And they were kind of forced into it because their first product had failed. It was a form of logic. It was RTL, resistor transistor logic, and those weren't working. People had moved to more digital or diode transistor logic. And so they didn't move fast enough, so then they went into MOS, which they had picked up at Fairchild Labs. And they started working on that, and that really required a lot of education, and that's where not only the technical articles, but classes. So we started producing materials for teaching people how to design with MOS technology, because it was more like actually in design like a vacuum tube than it was like a transistor.
Was that a breakthrough, that
Oh, yeah.
teaching your customers how to use your product?
Yeah. And in fact, they made more money teaching than they did on the product. Because they were all military, right? So the military would sign up for it, the military designers. And so that became, we built a big, thick binder, and we went out and hired some professors at local universities. Actually, San Jose State was a big provider of some of the solid state professors there who came and would teach sort of the boilerplate, and then our guys would fill in. So it was really managing that and putting those together around the country. And so it became much more engaged in trying to move the technology forward into the mainstream. And so that became sort of my task. And there was...
This was just an open field, wasn't it? I mean, there was no template for how to market these companies and how to open up these markets and educate a whole consumer base.
And there really wasn't the vehicles, right? I mean, other than trade magazines. I mean, that was because the business magazines really hadn't bought into it. I'll give you some example. There were no editorial offices here on the West Coast. I think Time magazine had one, but they had a science editor. And he covered the oil companies and pharmaceutical companies and, things like that, McKesson or whatever was here. But they didn't cover the technology companies down the valley. And I was told by an analyst at Morgan Stanley in New York, those little companies in Silicon Valley will never make it. That that they're going to be overcome by the bigger companies on the East Coast who have much more resources to take them to market. And in fact, they read a report to that fact that it's more likely that new fields are going to be opened up by divisions of big companies because they have the resources and the talent to put behind marketing on a broad scale. These little companies don't have it.
And who did they feel would do that overtaking?
Oh, IBM, Burroughs, Univac, eventually Digital Equipment, all these big Eastern technology companies, so forth.
And what was the attitude here in Silicon Valley about all of that? They certainly must have seen all these big companies, many of whom were their customers, buying their product. How did they think about that competitively and just from a way of building a business?
Well, they were growing, but they were growing by a large point, particularly in the 60s, in the military market. So it really didn't matter that much. They hated the military market. You got to realize that the military market was a high average selling price for the product, but it paid for in a pound of silicon, because you would take your devices and you would test them by various parameters, and those that fell off the edge were consumer products. Those that got a narrower parameter were industrial products, and then the final ones that were you get put what these called a full shake, rattle, and roll on, those became the military products, and those you could charge at a real premium. But it was very limited in quantity, and yields on let's say some sort of a semiconductor device were fairly, particularly as you got into integrated circuits, was fairly low. There was all kinds of things wrong. I mean, if I show you pictures of the clean room, it wasn't a clean room. It was you put on a smock. That was it in a clean room. And so there was there just hadn't evolved at all in all of the aspects of creating an environment for high quality, pristine kinds of devices that were required. I mean, a piece of dust on a chip of silicon that's a 1/4 inch square looks like a boulder under a microscope. I mean, it looks like a boulder. It's just a big chunk there, and so that destroys the device. And so, so many things had to come into place to really build yield, and that took experimentation. At GME, they took some devices they used to put them in like a little Petri dish, and they were carrying these devices across the room, the office, going to send them to the military, and they shipped them off. And when they got there, they were all dead devices, and they couldn't figure it out. What they found out was that walking across the carpet with these put electrical static on the leads and zapped all the devices. And so then that taught them they had to put some kind of protective diodes on the leads so that they could protect the devices. How else would they learn that except by blowing $250,000 worth of devices?
You have a couple of props that this might be an opportune time to. You mentioned vacuum tubes a minute ago.
Well, yeah, the vacuum tube. This is an older one I bought somewhere, but some of you are probably familiar with this as you were kids. You could look in the back of your radio. I remember as a kid. It was interesting. We had an old RCA stand-up radio as I was a kid, and I always used to go into the back of it, and they had a diagram. And they showed you the diagram and the leads and the tubes sitting there. And so you couldn't really figure out what was going on because you didn't know enough as a kid. But it was these sorts of, most of them are bigger than this. But this is a glass tube which has elements in it that light up and then send electrons from one passage to another, but you can turn them on and off. And so it becomes a switch. And that was replaced by a transistor. And this is probably not going to be seen by anybody, but I'll put it up here. That's an epoxy transistor, one transistor. And that was probably, they were sold by the millions back in early 60s. And my career, one of my first promotions, the reason I have this is because I sent out a bunch of samples in little cards, and I kept some of those. And I have 2 left. I don't know what happened to all the others, but I still have 2 left. And I like to compare my beginning in my career in Silicon Valley with this single transistor.
The single transistor.
And this watch, which has 3 billion transistors in it. So when we talk about, the whole idea, it takes a village to raise a person, to raise technology takes a whole infrastructure of myriads of kinds of innovations. It's not simply somebody going in and starting a semiconductor business. It's the tools, the instrumentation. So at GME, everything was custom made. They made the cameras. They made the, and so I was there while they built all this stuff. They built the burn-in ovens. They had people come in and sheet metal people and all that sort of thing come in and do it. But you went in, there wasn't a big company. It was all in one building. And there wasn't I don't know how many people there, but it never reached more than $10 million in size. So I knew everybody there, and I knew everything that was going on. And so the ability to watch all this stuff, to watch them cut the Mylar masks on the light tables, to see those masks put up and photographed and then reduced, to see I have an ingot. I have a 1-inch ingot that's about that long. At one end of the plant, they grew out of molten silicon. They grew the ingot, and it turned very slowly. It'd take, a week to grow a crystal. And then they sliced them, polished them, and then started basically it's a photographic process of masking and exposing and masking and exposing. So it was a fairly, it reminds me of hearing Bob Noyce talk about when he was a kid and going out and seeing what went on in the car. He could open up the hood and you could see the pistons, you could see the spark plugs. You understood, you put some gas into the piston and you just light a spark and it pushes it down. You got to know how it works. Yeah. This was exactly the same thing for me. You knew exactly how semiconductors were made and how they evolved. At the end of that line, they had a packaging group. And so you packaged them and you had to connect the leads. So there was a whole array of workers in the back room that, under microscopes, soldered each little lead onto the device. And then in 1960, roughly 65, GME got a contract to build an electronic calculator for Monroe Calculator. And I will insert picture of calculator. I have it.
You have a picture of it. That's good.
It looked almost exactly like the Apple II. It was that size and shape, except it had a little screen on it.
Wow.
And it contained 39 LSI chips. And it reduced a electromechanical calculator from literally thousands of parts down to 39. And they were building those at the other end. So you saw the silicon, I saw the molten silicon, and I saw the calculator all in my few years of getting my MBA at GME.
Is that what it was like for you,
Yeah.
getting an MBA?
Yeah.
And a technical degree all at the same time?
Well, you knew what everybody was doing. The company was struggling.
I was going to ask you how it was doing from a business standpoint.
Well, from a business standpoint, the problem wasn't that it couldn't have sold everything it make. It couldn't make everything it could. As Phil Ferguson says in his oral history, they wouldn't buy what we made, and we couldn't make what they wanted, what they wanted to buy. The devices were very complex. They were putting between 10 and 100 transistors on a substrate, and that was reaching the capacity of the process. And so the yields were very low, very, very, very low. And the calculators, they could only produce a few of them. And you know, when you're talking about calculators, they announced this thing in a big nationwide campaign. Monroe did, and they were going to be cheaper and so forth. They went down. The average calculator was the price of an average family car at that time, and these were going to go down to a few $1,000s, to $2,500 or something like that. Well, you couldn't do that unless you could produce these things in volume, and GME could never produce them. And so that, you know, they were pouring more and more money into it, and then they were sold to Philco Ford. So the business aspects of it, and fortunately, I mean, I was always part of the sort of the flow of information in that company. Phil Ferguson, who was president, was a good friend, and fortunately protected me a lot from the Philco people who really wanted me to clear everything I did with them. And I just told them to go to hell, and Phil backed me up. So, you know, I wasn't going to do that just by principle.
Right. Yeah.
Back in Philadelphia, they were people out of Ford, and I got to witness what the bureaucracy of these large corporations can do to small companies.
Did that influence you? You were talking, I'm specifically interested in what you were saying earlier about the belief on Wall Street that the big companies would eventually crush these Silicon Valley companies, and you were skeptical of that. Did the Philco Ford experience help you understand why that might not be the case?
Oh, certainly, because it became who's in charge more than what has to be done. And you know, they had all these classes of people. Even when they bought GME, they gave everybody an examination. They brought in this outside firm to give us management firm to give us all tests, and they gave me a test, and they concluded that I was not fit for the engineering world. Yeah,
They said that to you.
Yeah, they gave all that was a result of my test. My psychological test was that I was not psychologically fit to work with engineers.
Did they tell you why?
I was too intuitive.
And what did that mean?
I don't know, but I've been there, you know, about 55 years, so I'm sure they're not in their business 55 years.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they categorized you, and everything was, you know, it was, you know, your grade, that's how your salary, the kind of desk you got, even the kind of company car you could have, all sorts of details down to how many desk drawers you could have, and everything else was all in a binder. And so it was really run by, when they say run by the book, that was run by the book.
And was the upshot of your test result that you weren't going to be able to be in marketing or maybe even be with the company? Was that the...
Yeah, they thought I would, you know, move to some other field. They didn't say what, just some other field.
Some other field, but not doing what you were doing.
Right.
And then what happened?
Well, the one thing that really stirred up a lot at GME was that I had an ad agency in San Francisco that was called Hofer, Dietrich and Brown. They were sort of the largest kind of consumer agency, but they did some industrial stuff as well. And I had hired them to do our advertising, and they introduced me to a man by the name of Tom Kamafuji. Tom was an illustrator from the sort of the psychedelic era of San Francisco. He did all these beautiful multicolor designs, particularly like kabuki figures. And he was more of a fine artist than he was an illustrator, but he also was a fine artist. And I have some of his prints, and they're really outstanding designs. And they made a series of ads taking these semiconductor devices and turning them all into these Kamafuji figures. And they were really brilliant. And so I got the company to agree to do an insert around the MOS launch on those. And we did, I think we did 4-page insert, all, I think it was 6 or 7 colors. And if you look at those and you look at them today, you would say they stole the idea from Apple, but in fact, we brought that idea to Apple. And that's how the first logo at Apple got. So GME produced that, and it got Henry Ford's attention. It got everybody at Ford's attention. They then put pressure on Philco. Philco then put pressure on me. They wanted me to go back and meet with all the bigwigs and to do whatever they told me to do, and I basically, I won't tell you what I said, but I told them in their presence no in very uncertain terms.
Very explicit terms.
Very explicit terms, and I just didn't want to. This was back on the main line in Philadelphia, and all the now that I've been in Silicon Valley, you don't go back up to those places again. In any event, that fortunately, my company backed me and what I wanted to do, and of course, it was also the link to the MOS world for Intel.
Yes.
But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that later. I'm going to ask you a few more general questions about your observations of, first of all, since GME was struggling, what did you learn in this early phase of your career about why companies in Silicon Valley were succeeding and why some companies weren't?
I think that there was a lot of experimentation going on, a lot, and I think that what happens is that it's not just know-how, it's certainly having the right backing behind you, because if something were precarious and a high risk and it faltered, the backing would collapse.
And where was the backing coming from in general terms? Could you talk a little bit about that, why that was so key?
Yeah, well, at Fairchild, it was coming from Fairchild.
Sure.
So they did fail in a lot of products and a lot of their research and so forth. And so at Hewlett-Packard, Hewlett-Packard Labs went through a lot of experimentation, but Hewlett-Packard supported them. At Varian Labs, a lot of experimentation and failure, but Varian was supporting them. So they had a commercial enterprises that supported it. Later on, it would become the venture community, and more expressly the venture community. But the startups were very precarious, and a lot of them went out of business, a lot of them. I was working with a firm, I don't remember the name of it. It's in John Markoff's latest book, but it was a fellow who was backed by Don Valentine in the early days in the 1970s in artificial intelligence. And that was a client of mine in the 70s. And, he really tried to build a business out of it. And at that time, it just became too risky and too obscure as to what the market would be. And so people will back away. So there wasn't a market infrastructure to take this stuff out. There weren't the concept of partnerships that you wanted to build. There wasn't the idea of, like in a computer, third-party software, because they weren't building computers. They were building largely semiconductor. My first 9 clients when I started my business were semiconductor companies. I had 9 semiconductor companies as clients, all making different stuff. And
everything a component of something bigger.
Something, yeah. They were making field effect transistors or some sort of amplifier, or using a different form of logic to create something, or a different technology. There was all sorts of people coming out with different ways of designing the devices and V-chips and all sorts of things, and to create them faster or more reliable or something of that nature. So there was a lot of specialization going on.
So people had to be able to survive experimentation and failures, because there was a lot of failure. It was a completely new area. And what about leadership and management? Who were the leaders, the people in the field who were the most important here in Silicon Valley at that time? At
that time, it would be hard to say who the leaders were. because they weren't, it wasn't as distinguishable. There was a company called Ampex that was up in Redwood City. I think there's still a sign up there that says Ampex on the freeway. They were a leader in what people thought would be America's leadership in consumer electronics. They made tape drives. So the story is that the patents were copied by Japan, and that then they came in with lower priced products and undersold them, and there was a lot of disputes in the courts and so forth, but Ampex never survived it, and so they were clearly one of the leaders at the time. I don't, in my mind, I don't think Varian and HP were very specialized, and they didn't spin people out. You know, in the 60s, you didn't see people, starting a company out of Hewlett-Packard or out of Varian. You saw them they were mostly out of Fairchild. And so Fairchild then had this long tail of people with expertise that they knew the expertise of that person. When Spork started, went to national, he knew who the experts were. And I'll give you an idea of Don Valentine, what he did. For example, when he went out to recruit a sales force, he didn't hire salesmen. He went to Philadelphia, and he went to Baltimore, and he went to Boston. And he went to the TI salesman, top salesman there, or the top salesman at Motorola, and he said, we will set you up in your own rep firm, and we will guarantee you all of our devices and your exclusive territory. So you start the business, we'll give you, and we'll give you 90 days or some great credit terms. So he basically got a sales force who were independent, on their own, hungry to build businesses without having to hire salesmen.
Taking their own risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was really innovation.
Yeah.
And it was marketing innovation.
Yes.
And that really did, I think, establish a precedent in the marketplace. So that was rare. He did it with application engineers as well. He hired application engineers and he put them in the sales offices, but they were not allowed to take orders. They weren't allowed to price. They weren't allowed to talk about delivery. They were simply to work with customers in helping them design National's products into their systems. And that business we went from, when I joined them in '67, that was only a few months after they started, and they went to well over 70 million in 3 years, which was a lot in those days. So I'd say that in the early 60s and that, it was mainly semiconductors. There were other companies, but not too many of those survived because they were all experimentations of one kind or another. And there may be some seeds of those companies still left, but I think a lot of them vanished over time because there was a whole wave of new, not only just the integrated circuit came in the meantime, that integrated a lot of the old discrete components, but then there were other types of devices, gate arrays and things of nature that would package things and program things. And then there was the whole revolution of the microprocessor. And all of that was new waves upon new waves of new companies that took advantage of those new technologies. And so you just kind of wash under those old ones underneath.
As the tide just rolled forward.
Yeah, but in all, overall, everybody gains experience.
Yes.
And so this valley, I always said that it wasn't just a reinvestment of money, it was a reinvestment of knowledge. And so most of these companies that came along get people on the board who were there before. They would get people on the board who had run a company or been part of a company or are part of a company. And so they're reinvesting their knowledge back into a startup. And it's not just the money, it's really that knowledge that's actually more key.
And what was your experience of the culture of Silicon Valley as it was emerging at that point. It wasn't known as Silicon Valley at the time, but that
Right.
was that this area was clearly where all this was going on. And you were here. You'd come from the East Coast, where people had different approaches. What were you observing and learning during this period?
Okay, the first one was that it was the semiconductor industry that created the sort of camaraderie. You didn't go to the Wagon Wheel and meet people from HP. You didn't, or Varian, or Food Machinery Corporation, or Lockheed. And so for many years, and I still, when people sort of criticize me for it, but I didn't include HP or Varian or Lockheed or these other companies in Silicon Valley. They weren't part of the model. The model being Noyce spinning out of Shockley and being the traitorous eight and building an egalitarian environment where everybody had their say, where everybody participated and shared in the rewards, and then finding venture money or outside people to help them to finance the enterprise. That's a model that's been recapitulated over and over and over again and gotten more refined and better. But none of those companies I mentioned while they were here did that until later. And some of the early, Tom Perkins was one of the first to spin out of HP, and Tandem Computer spun out of HP, but it was after Tom had gone out and knew these people and started pulling them out. And Varian really didn't spin out almost anything. They were in the computer business and got out of it. And so I'm in a whole different realm than this sort of Terman, Stanford. I sort of think they tapped into this later, that universities do as they often do, they follow the money. And as the money grew, their interest and ownership grew. And everybody reinvents history, and it's still going on at quite a bit.
Yep. So that was one thing that was happening, the semiconductor industry, and the unique way that the people in that industry related to each other. That was a major influence.
I think the microelectronics base was really essential because the microelectronics people began calling on these next levels. So if you were an instrument maker, if you were a machine tool manufacturer, if you were building a circuit board or any kind of next level electronics, there was an interface between you and a semiconductor company. So the semiconductor guys were learning about that next level.
And moving really quickly.
Yes. And so, the advent of these application engineers who began to learn about how to apply this circuitry into machine tools. And so, that was a sort of a knowledge transfer. And it was a very close relationship between the semiconductor industry and the machine tool manufacturers, Cincinnati Millicron, for example. And so, and that it was that sort of next level up that you began seeing ideas emerge in Silicon Valley into different kinds of instrumentation. Medical instrumentation came early. More sophisticated, what was it, Wave Tech? There was a company that did the sonograms. There was a client of ours that did the first fetus image, was here in the Valley, things like that. But that came about because the circuitry became more sophisticated, the devices, better, faster speeds, primarily, and devices that could do the logic faster, could do a simulation faster. And so that just kept bubbling up. And I think if it weren't for the microelectronics industry, I don't think Silicon Valley would be here.
And in that context, Regis, why was a culture of risk-taking and innovation able to take root here in a way that it really didn't take root anywhere else.
And again, I can go back to that industry because these were the people who did the risk taking. You know, they were spinning out of a company that they had jobs, they had very secure jobs, but they were starting something with this venture money. They were all very unique characters, the people who founded these companies. You know, I mean, you can think of Jerry Sanders as an example. I mean, Jerry was a sales guy, but he was a brilliant, brilliant person. And, you know, born on I think the south side of Chicago, when he was a salesman for Fairchild, he tells the story of he had one dark suit, and the cloth, they put the light cloth underneath in the padding, and it would show through. And he used to take his black pen when he'd go on a sales call and black it out so he didn't look so shabby. He pulled himself up, but he became a really he and Larry Ellison are a lot alike in the sense that they are bombastic. They are sort of self-promoters. Jerry Sanders loved being around Hollywood. He used to have a white Mercedes that he drove in San Francisco and a black one he drove in L.A., so he knew where he was, he said. Or no, it was a Rolls. I'm sorry, it was a Rolls Royce. So these were unique characters. So they demanded attention in many ways, and their risk taking and became more verbal, more out. They spoke up at a lot of forums and trade shows. So the characters now, as the trade shows grew, became less staid. It was less centered around IBM and DEC and the bunch, you know, Burroughs, Univac, Honeywell, and NCR, were the big. That was called the bunch. They were the computer companies that dominated the American scene, world scene, and you know, these new guys who went to the computer conferences and the solid state conferences and that were not the East Coast guys. These were these sort of renegade West Coasters. I went to a solid state circus conference very, very early with Bob Noyce, and I can remember the people. Noyce was saying he saw the telecommunications industry and the IT industry, you know, splitting apart, and that they were going to go their separate ways. And this was before the deregulation of AT&T, and he was criticized roundly for that. But he said the technology is going to drive it.
Yeah.
And he was right.
And he was right.
Yeah. And he also was. I remember him talking, actually I think it was at Ricky's in Palo Alto once, and he said, we will soon be able to run a whole business on a few chips. And somebody made a smart-ass comment that, well, I hope you don't drop those chips on the floor, they'll get lost in the crack and I'll go out of business. And Noyce said it won't matter, you'll be able to duplicate things, they'll cost so little, you'll be able to duplicate them in a million places. And, you know, I mean, and he had that sort of vision, and so he was risk taker because he was pushing those edges.
And he could see it.
So when people come out with these new ideas about doing something and then they go about and prove them, now you begin to say, hey, I'm not going to discredit them, I'm not going to discount them as much as I did before.
Yeah. It must have been a great environment for you thinking about just creative ways of marketing a whole new industry, because that was the expertise that you were developing. Did you find that at the time? This is the mid-'60s when you were getting ready to go to National Semiconductor and then eventually starting your own company.
Yeah, the key thing that I can sort of hang my hat on is marketing products where it's first time technologies. They didn't exist before. There was no model. You weren't unplugging something and putting something else in. It was a totally new idea. And that was with, I mean, even before Intel, spectrophysics and lasers. It was the laser, they developed a low cost, I think it was neon laser for scanning UPC codes. And they were trying to develop an under $100 laser to do that. one of the supermarket checkout counters, and that was widely pushed aside as people won't go near it because it'll cause cancer, it'll cause all kinds of ailments in human beings, and so it was actually boycotted. And when it did go into grocery stores, we had a client, National Advanced Systems sold equipment that way, and NCR, and it was boycotted by many of the consumers out there. And so getting those lasers into the marketplace took a vast education. Yeah. We did them took lasers into agriculture and construction. They used to run plumb lines. And plumb line with tell us, what is it? One of those sight things, and you could run a laser, and it's absolutely straight, and you could aim it at a target, and it would measure it perfectly. And so lasers became the common, and that happened in the 70s. And we were part of helping to launch that, and we built a whole campaigns around that, and that was very successful. The president, that was Sam Kalala, who's a venture capital guy here, was president of that one division, and we worked with Sam. And then, so when these things came along, you look at them and say, do I understand them? And when you know that the consumers don't understand them, or the customers don't understand them, and to do that, I had developed my own methods over time of identifying people that I would become friends with who were users. I got to know, for example, the head of the microelectronics lab at GE. And I got to know people like him in other companies and parts across the country at conferences and so forth, and I'd invite them to lunch or go see them. I used to just go see them, and they would become sort of my sounding boards for stuff. And they would tell me how complex it is. I'm trying to think of the name of the fellow who was sort of the Mr. IT of the United States. He ran American Airlines. He was IT CIO of Bank of America, and and he taught me. He said the customer is the architect of the computer system, and that was the guy who was the chief designer of computer systems. So it was that whole idea of outside in, of learning from the marketplace, bringing it back in. Yeah. And what they don't know, you have to either teach them, educate them, or bring them into it in some way so that they become part of it. And that's a long process, and I think we've gotten spoiled because we think that, well, Facebook came along and boom, it was overnight, and but it now has these new distribution channels that have their own problems, and stuff moves quickly and fast. But I would say that if you were to weigh the successes against the numbers of tries, it's a very small success versus the amount of tries that go over the internet.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to close this session with your move to National Semiconductor, and then you're eventually opening your own firm in 1970. But let me just ask you, what was attractive about National Semi at the time, and why did you choose to do that after GME?
Well, it was easy. First of all, I was having my problems with Philco. Right. They were acquired by Philco, so and they had tried to get me fired so many times, and I for some reason or other, I didn't care about that.
By the way, what happened to GME after it?
GME was acquired and was merged with Philco Microelectronics, and then moved back east.
And did it just sink beneath the waves?
Yeah, it got destroyed.
Yeah.
But the technology lived on, and because Philco Microelectronics didn't survive either, Philco went out of business, and so they all died, and it was the sort of the destruction old industries that were churned under, and yet out of it comes some little parcels that can be sparks that people were trying then that become part of the new industries, and you see it everywhere. I didn't know much about National, and because they weren't started yet. I mean, they basically had leased the building across the street from GME, and next to GME was a little company called Molectro, and that was some I don't know, it was some venture guys or someone had lured Bob Weidler and Dave Talbot out of Fairchild to be the key people there. Bob Weidler was the designer of probably, how will I put this, at least 75% of Fairchild's profits. And Talbot was the guy who knew how to make them. So they were Mutt and Jeff. They were two guys that worked together, but they didn't know anything about management and anything else. They were just going to design some stuff. But that was next door. Across the street was an empty building, and I got a call from Don Valentine, and Don said he'd like to meet with me. I didn't know Don Valentine. I didn't, I knew the Fairchild. I didn't know him, and I knew some of the people at Fairchild. And so I literally walked across the street. And when I went in, there was no furniture. There was nothing in the building. It was empty. He and Charlie Spork were pitching pennies against the wall. They were echoing. We had a conversation.
Did you know Charlie Spork at the time?
No, I knew of Spork
him.
because he was one of Noyce's, or he was one of Phil Ferguson's. Those two kind of work side by side. Maybe one worked for the other. But I just knew of him. We had an interview, and as long as that was it. I mean, he sort of hired me.
Did they describe to you what they needed for you to do, or what?
Yeah, it was a position called marketing services, which was sort of a catch-all for whatever needs to be done. And it included, the advertising, the PR. They really didn't call it PR. They basically just called it marketing services. It was largely literature. I did, technical articles, all of that sort of thing. It wasn't really well defined because there wasn't this sort of separate PR activity. But he needed somebody to do all that stuff, and I knew how to do it. And I was fairly confident in knowing how to do it. So later on, Don, he used to write everything in green ink, and he used to write them on the back of IBM cards, blank
punch cards.
Punch cards. And he after I'd been there maybe, I don't know, a year or 6 months, he pushed one of these cards at me, and it had names on it, and he said, "Those are the people that I interviewed before I talked to you." And I said, "Well, why didn't you hire any of those people?" And he said, I said, "Why did you hire me and not one of those?" He said, "Because I couldn't intimidate you." Well, if you work for people in the semiconductor industry, it was a tough bunch.
Yeah.
They're the down and dirty people of the business, or they were then. They were, it was highly competitive, the competition was really what made it so intense. You worked hard and you worked around the clock. And he knew that. And so I went to work for him, and there wasn't really much to it. The wonderful thing about Don Valentine, as I mentioned with his idea of hiring salespeople and things, which he told me what he was going to do and those sorts of things, was the amount of freedom he gave me. He wanted somebody to just go do things that help build the sales and help build the National's position. And he was up for anything. I got to travel the world, which is not what a person in my position would do. Usually you do it out of a desk front. He didn't want me sitting at a desk. So I would go out and work with regional managers, sales managers, customers, distributors. So I spent my time traveling, and went to every country in Europe when we opened offices, sales offices and distributors and reps there. I just started, I set up a technical printer and so forth in Eindhoven, so that we could ship stuff around the world and pay cheap prices for the literature we mailed. Because National did a lot of application notes. We did a lot of that training, teaching kinds of stuff.
And that sales process was the same as you
Yeah.
had discovered everywhere else. It
Yeah.
was training, teaching, engineers reading.
Yeah, and we did seminars over there, workshops and so forth around Europe. Weidler was a wonderful spokesman. I mean, he would command audiences of hundreds of people, hundreds of engineers, and would usually keep a glass of gin by his side, and I was in charge of keeping him in line.
How did that go?
Not well. No, I did pretty well. There was one time when we were out to dinner and we had a presentation the next morning, a conference, and he was lit, but he could be more rational lit than most people could, he went to the John, and I told everybody to move their clocks ahead on their watches an hour or two, and we all did. And he came back, and I said, "Wow, look at that! It's 1 o'clock in the morning." So
Meeting adjourned.
So we got him off the bed.
Was he okay? Under those circumstances, could he get up the next morning and
he was excellent.
pull it together? Yeah.
And people really listened to him. I mean, he was very clever. When he published data sheets or application notes, he always put errors in the electrical designs because he didn't want people to copy him. And he wouldn't tell where it was or how it was, but it would affect the whole process.
And did that become evident because other people followed those specs? Is that?
No, he would tell you. I've got something in there that will know if somebody copies it. And besides, Talbot was such a genius at making his designs work. But he was a genius. I mean, he was a wild man. I mean, he would disappear at times, and nobody knew where he was. And then when he would come back, he would have a small box with devices in it, a data sheet, and an application note. And he'd say, "Here." He'd take it to Floyd Kwame or Don and say, "Here." He wouldn't tell anybody what he was doing up until that point. So you didn't even know what he was designing.
Were there other things about working there that influenced you? Lessons you learned that?
I think the big thing was again, Don's allowing me to explore the world, to get to see different cultures, to understand that people understood things in different ways, and the competition was much different in Europe than it was here. There were many semiconductor companies in Europe at the time. Cisco Sam and French had competitors. Italians had there was a big company in Italy, and just the cultural idea of having Americans come over there and sort of have the sort of brash sales attitude. And so to mellow that, you had to really, kind of build more of the educational approach into what you did. And it made them feel better about you, and if they felt better about you, they'd move your products. But the knowledge base of the world of electronics really broadened for me. I'd say they did more for me than I did for them. Because, once you get involved in introducing those sort of products, you're doing the same thing over and over again, because they made pretty much the same standard line of products. They got into various types of logic. They really hadn't gotten into the whole micro. Later on they went into tried to get into the microprocessor business, and and I did help them when I started my business, because one of my early companies was Linear Technology, which was a spin out of National, and Bob Swanson and I was on their board, an early investor, and while I was doing my company, and I tried to settle the lawsuits between the two, because I knew everybody on both sides. And there were things like that I think I did. There was Tom Peters really disliked National. He used to badmouth them all the time about, Spork really wasn't someone who worried about not the cleanliness, but how your building looked. Or he said you could have mahogany walls at home or you can have them at work. What do you want them? And but he was a hard-nosed manufacturing guy, and a good one, an excellent one actually, and somehow or other they sort of ignored Tom Peters, and Peters just every time he gave a talk he would say something negative about National, and so I got a call from the marketing director. This was again years later, and he said, I want you to meet. So I met with him and Charlie says, it just irks me that he keeps putting us down in quality when they had excellent quality, better than in many instances, ranking higher than Intel. And I said, well, invite him in to talk. And Charlie says, I'll never do that. I said, well, that's my advice. Invite him in to talk. Ask him to come in and give a talk on how to build quality. He says, what the hell does, Charlie, he just screamed, what the hell? I said, do it. He did it. He just stopped doing that. They then, from then on, became a model of success. And, don't fight them. Join them, don't fight them.
Yeah.
And so, I stayed close to the company and a lot of the people there. And obviously, still know Floyd and Don is a good friend and things like that.
Yeah. Well, and in a larger sense, this ties into the points you were making earlier, which was everybody's learning at this point, right? There's no necessarily right way or wrong way to do it. There's certainly right and wrong ways to go about manufacturing and so forth, but just from the standpoint of learning how to do business in this entirely new business, everybody was learning from everyone, weren't they?
And yes, and there were so many people that were alike, and the whole idea of I don't know, I read Flatland very, very early in my life, and it's where everything is a line or a dot or a cube or whatever, but they're all one-dimensional in Flatland, and nobody tries to be two-dimensional, and so as a result, no matter how different you think you are, when everybody looked at from the outside world, you're all the same. And so I use that many times as examples of you can be in the semiconductor business, but you could be different. And you need not be the same as everybody else. And so why market the same way? It's where you can distinguish yourself in service. And so that was really sort of the message that I tried to implement in my company, is doing things like you were doing something unique and different. And so I very early started thinking about, I'm going to do what my clients are doing. They're all pushing innovation. So I started thinking about how can we innovate. And I hated the idea that people thought we did the same thing as everybody else did, because that's anathema in most businesses. So I didn't call it public relations, I called it market relations. And things like that.
And very strategic.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, that's great, Regis. I think that's it for this session.
Okay.
We'll pick up here the next time, and I think it would be good, you and I can go over, I'm sure you'll turn this over in your mind, and there'll be things that may come up that you want to cover that we've talked. We can begin the next session with some of those things. And
Okay.
then I think we'll move on to 1970 and the launch of your company. And,
Okay.
Well, that'll be the start of session 2.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.
Great, John.
Thank you.